The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad omen as far as Belle Hayes was concerned, because every terrible thing that had ever happened to her had happened on a Tuesday. She stood on the platform of the Tucson train station in the blazing September heat of 1883, holding a carpetbag that contained everything she owned in the world: 2 dresses, a pair of worn leather boots, a small Bible with her mother's handwriting pressed into the margins, and enough coins to last her perhaps another week if she ate sparingly and asked for nothing. The letter was tucked into the pocket of her blue traveling dress, folded and refolded so many times that the creases had worn thin and pale, like old scars. She had read it so often she could recite it word for word, and yet she still pulled it out now, standing in the dusty heat with the smell of coal smoke and horse manure thick in the air, and read it again. The letter was addressed to a woman named Clara Weston. It described that woman in careful, admiring terms: a schoolteacher from Ohio, 24 years of age, well-read and mild-tempered, experienced with household management, and not opposed to life on a cattle ranch in the Arizona Territory. It described her as neat, patient, and above all steady. The man who had written the letter, one Isaac Sheridan, owner of the Sheridan cattle operation some 40 miles east of Tucson, had been corresponding with Clara Weston through a mail-order arrangement for the better part of 4 months. He had proposed in the previous letter. Clara had accepted. And then Clara had met a traveling salesman from Denver on the train from Columbus, fallen desperately in love over the course of 6 days, and sent Belle to Tucson in her place. Belle had not agreed to this arrangement so much as she had been unable to refuse it. Clara was her cousin, her only remaining family after the fever had taken Belle's mother 2 winters past, and Clara had looked at her with those wide, urgent blue eyes and said that she simply could not leave Edward, could not possibly go to Arizona when Edward was right there in Denver asking her to stay, and would Belle please go in her place, because the man had already paid for the train ticket, and if someone didn't show up, he would be left waiting and humiliated, and the whole thing was already arranged, and Belle didn't have anywhere else to go anyway, did she? Belle did not have anywhere else to go. That was the plainest truth of her situation. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had died of pneumonia, and a father she had never known, and she had been living in Clara's spare room in Columbus for 8 months on the generosity of her cousin's household. When Clara's mother, Aunt Ruth, had looked at Belle across the breakfast table and said very quietly that perhaps this was the best solution for everyone, Belle had understood that everyone in that sentence meant everyone except Belle. She had packed her bag. She had taken the ticket. She had told herself on the train west that she would find a way to explain, that surely the man would understand, that perhaps he would even appreciate her honesty. Now she was here, and the train was already steaming back the direction it had come, and somewhere in this town or coming down the road toward it was a man who was expecting to meet Clara Weston. Belle smoothed the letter against the front of her dress one more time, then folded it and tucked it back in her pocket. She squared her shoulders. She was not Clara Weston, and she never could be, but she was here, and she was breathing, and she had survived worse than this. At least, she thought she probably had. The station was not large. Tucson in 1883 was a growing town. It had been something of a lawless frontier settlement not 10 years past, but the railroad had changed things considerably, bringing commerce and a certain rough kind of civilization with it. There were several saloons, a general store, a hotel of modest quality, a church still under construction, and enough adobe buildings along the main street to give the impression of permanence. The heat was extraordinary. Belle had grown up in Ohio and had thought she understood heat, but Ohio heat was a gentle, humid warmth compared to this dry, anvil-like blaze that seemed to come from every direction at once, bouncing off the packed earth and the white adobe walls and the pale sky above. She was still standing on the platform, trying to decide what to do next, when she heard boots on the wooden planks behind her and a voice said, "Ma'am, Are you waiting for a ride out to the Sheridan Ranch? She turned around. Isaac Sheridan was not what she had pictured from his letters. Clara had shown them to her careful, deliberate letters, full of practical information about the ranch and the territory and the kind of life he was offering, with occasional moments of something warmer tucked between the sentences like pressed flowers in a book. From those letters, Belle had formed the image of a methodical, perhaps slightly stiff, middle-aged man who had decided to acquire a wife with the same thorough efficiency he probably applied to acquiring livestock. She had pictured someone lean and weathered and serious, with dust permanently in the lines of his face. He was lean and weathered. She had been right about that much. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, with broad shoulders under a dark canvas work shirt and forearms that suggested a life of genuine physical labor rather than the foreman-from-a-distance kind. His hat was well-made but plain, dark with sweat at the band. His hair was dark brown, cut short and somewhat at odds with itself, as though it had been combed that morning in a deliberate attempt at presentability that the wind had since undone. He was, she thought, somewhere around 30, perhaps a year or two on either side. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something resistant, and his eyes, when she looked at them directly, were the particular clear gray of early morning sky before the sun got properly started. He was not stiff. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it slowly at the brim in a gesture that she immediately recognized as nervousness, and there was something in the set of his expression, carefully arranged into politeness but not entirely successful at concealing the fact that he was anxious, that made her chest do something unexpected and unhelpful. "Mr. Sheridan," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, a slight adjustment, almost imperceptible, like a man recalibrating. "You must be Miss Weston. I'm glad the train was on time. The summer schedule's been unreliable." This was the moment. She had planned this moment, had rehearsed it on the train, had told herself she would be calm and clear and simply explain the situation. She had planned to say something like, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," and present the facts in an orderly fashion. What she said instead was, "I need to tell you something and I need you to hear it before we go any further." He went still. The hat stopped turning. His eyes moved over her face with a careful attention that she found unsettling in its thoroughness. "All right," he said. "My name is Belle Hayes. I am Clara Weston's cousin." She kept her voice even, which cost her something. "Clara did not come. She met someone on the train from Columbus and she is going to marry him instead. I am sorry. She sent me because the ticket was paid for and she did not know what else to do. And I came because I did not have anywhere else to go. And I understand completely if you want me to get on the next train back east. But I didn't want to show up at your ranch pretending to be someone I'm not, only for you to find out later, which you would have, because I am not the woman that letter described." She stopped. She had said all of it in one long breath, and now she needed another one. "I am truly sorry, Mr. Sheridan. I know this is not what you arranged for. None of it is what you arranged for." The silence that followed was so long that she was certain she was about to be escorted back to the ticket window. Then Isaac Sheridan let out a long, slow breath through his nose, looked down at the hat in his hands, and said very quietly, "The next train east doesn't come until Thursday." Belle blinked. "I beg your pardon." He looked up at her. Those gray eyes were doing something she couldn't read. "The next train east doesn't leave until Thursday morning. So unless you plan to spend 2 nights in the hotel, which I suspect costs more than you've got," he glanced at her carpetbag with a frankness that was not unkind, "you might as well come out to the ranch and we can work out what happens next from there." "That's a very practical response to what I just told you," Belle said. "I'm a practical man." He paused. He was looking at her with that careful, recalibrating expression again. "What did you say your name was?" "Belle Hayes." He said the name quietly, as though trying the weight of it. "Miss Hayes." He put his hat back on. "My wagon's out front. You're welcome to the ride if you want it, no conditions attached." She picked up her carpetbag. She was not sure if she was making a terrible decision, But then again, all of her decisions lately had been terrible, and at least this one came with a roof over her head for 2 nights. "Thank you, Mr. Sheridan." He reached out and took the carpetbag from her hand before she'd finished the sentence, tucking it under one arm as though it weighed nothing. He did not say anything else. He just turned and walked toward the front of the station, and after a moment, Belle followed him. The wagon was a good one, solid and well-maintained, hitched to 2 bay horses that stood patiently in the shade of the station's front overhang. He loaded her bag into the back with a practiced ease, and then offered her a hand up to the front bench. His hand was very warm and his grip was absolutely steady, and Belle, who had not been properly looked after by anyone in quite a long time, felt the unexpected sting of tears behind her eyes and absolutely refused to let them fall. The road out of Tucson was a dirt track that wound through terrain so alien to Belle's experience that she spent the first several miles simply staring at it. She had never seen saguaro cactus before, tall and solemn as sentinels, some of them 40 feet high, their arms lifted in postures of ancient resignation. She had never seen this particular quality of red in the earth, a deep, burnt ochre that the late afternoon sun turned nearly orange. The sky was vast in a way that Ohio skies never were, pressed down by no visible horizon, just an endless pale blue dome that made her feel simultaneously small and somehow freer than she had felt in a long time. Isaac Sheridan drove with the easy competence of a man who had made this journey hundreds of times, handling the reins loosely, his eyes moving over the landscape with a habitual vigilance that was not anxious but simply watchful. He did not speak for a long time, and Belle discovered that she did not mind the silence. It was not the uncomfortable kind. It was simply the kind that belonged to this place, to this wide-open country that seemed to require a certain quiet respect. After perhaps 20 minutes, he said, without looking at her, "Was she happy about it? Your cousin?" Belle considered the question. "Clara." She was beside herself with joy about the Denver man. She felt very guilty about the rest of it. "She should," he said, without rancor. 4 months is a significant investment of time and intention. "I know, I told her that." Belle paused. "She's not a bad person. She's just the kind of person who gets swept up very quickly in things. And you're not." She looked at him. He was still watching the road, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. "I'm the opposite," she said. "I think about things too much and act too late." "How'd that work out with this situation?" "Despite everything," she laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, genuine in a way she hadn't expected. "Not well," she admitted. He did smile then, briefly, just a slight turn at the corner of his mouth, and he looked at the road and did not say anything else for a while. And Belle looked at the cactus and the red earth and the enormous sky, and thought that perhaps Thursday was not necessarily the only option available to her. Then she told herself firmly not to be foolish, and looked at the cactus some more. The Sheridan Ranch appeared around a bend in the road as the sun was beginning its descent, painting everything in deep gold and long purple shadow. It was larger than she had expected, not the modest homestead she had imagined from the letters, but a proper working operation. There was a main house of pale adobe brick, 2 stories, with a wide covered porch running the full length of the front. Behind it stood a substantial barn and a series of outbuildings, and beyond those, she could see the dark shape of cattle moving slowly against the hillside, tended by 2 figures on horseback. A windmill turned slowly near the well, its iron wheel catching the last light. A man came out of the barn as the wagon rolled into the yard, short, compact, perhaps 55, with a sun-darkened face and quick dark eyes. He looked at Belle with frank curiosity, and then at Isaac with something that was clearly a question. "Hector," Isaac said, climbing down from the wagon, "this is Miss Belle Hayes. She'll be staying a couple of nights. Put the horses up for me." Hector looked at Belle, at her carpetbag, at Isaac's face, and apparently decided that whatever questions he had would keep. "Yes, boss," he said, and took the reins. Isaac helped Belle down from the wagon again and then picked up her bag and carried it toward the house. A woman appeared in the doorway, broad, perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair pinned severely at the back of her head and an expression of calm, sharp intelligence. This was Margaret, the housekeeper, who had been with the Sheridan operation for 11 years and who, as Belle would learn later, had strong opinions about nearly everything and was usually right. "This is not Miss Weston," Margaret said, looking at Belle. "No," Isaac agreed. "Margaret, this is Miss Belle Hayes from Ohio. She'll need the guest room." Margaret looked at Belle with the kind of thorough assessment that Belle had not experienced since her mother had been alive. Then she said, "You've been traveling all day and you look like it. Come inside. Supper will be ready in an hour and you can wash up." It was not warm exactly, but it was practical and direct, and Belle found that she preferred it enormously to false warmth. She followed Margaret inside. The house was cool after the heat of the day. Thick adobe walls did that, Belle would learn, kept the heat at bay in summer and the cold at bay in winter. The interior was plainly furnished but not sparse. There were good rugs on the floors, a solid dining table, bookshelves along one wall of the main room that held an impressive collection for a cattle ranch in the Arizona Territory, and in the kitchen, a cast iron stove that smelled of wood smoke and the beginning of supper. Margaret showed her upstairs to a room at the end of the hall, small, whitewashed, with a narrow bed under a patchwork quilt and a window that looked east toward mountains she didn't yet know the name of. "There's water in the basin," Margaret said. "Dinner's beans and corn bread and whatever else I can manage on short notice. We weren't expecting a guest." She said the last part without accusation. It was simply a statement of fact. She turned to go. "Mrs. I'm sorry, I don't know your surname," Belle said. "McCready, but Margaret's fine." She paused at the door. "He's a good man, you know, better than most I've seen." She looked at Belle steadily for a moment. "That's all I'll say." She left. Belle stood in the small room with the evening light coming through the window and the sound of the windmill turning faintly outside, and she pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed carefully and tried to think about Thursday. She did not succeed particularly well. Supper was the four of them: Belle, Isaac, Margaret, and Hector, who it turned out was Hector Ruiz, the ranch foreman, whose family had lived in this part of the territory long before it was the Arizona Territory at all. The conversation was careful, circling around the obvious questions with a delicacy that Belle appreciated. Isaac told her about the ranch, 1,200 head of cattle, 40 miles of fence that needed constant maintenance, 2 full-time hands and 3 seasonal ones who came through during roundup. He told her this without any apparent agenda, the way a person described the shape of his life simply because it was the natural thing to do. She asked questions because she was genuinely curious, and she noticed that each time she asked something specific, about the water situation, about the cattle market, about the fence trouble he'd mentioned, he looked at her with a brief, attentive sharpening of focus, as though he was cataloging the fact that she was paying attention. After supper, Margaret disappeared into the kitchen and Hector went back to the bunkhouse, and Belle and Isaac sat on the front porch in the cooling dark. The stars over Arizona were extraordinary, nothing like Ohio, nothing like anything she had seen. They were so dense and bright they looked nearly solid, and the Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, and Belle sat on the porch steps and looked up at them and forgot for a moment to be anxious about anything at all. "Have you always lived here?" she asked. Isaac was sitting in one of the 2 wooden chairs behind her, his long legs stretched out, a cup of coffee balanced on one knee. "Came out from Texas when I was 19 with my father and my uncle. Built the first part of this ranch on land we bought from a family who was heading back east. My father died 8 years ago, my uncle 2 years after that." He paused. "I've been running it alone since then." Belle turned to look at him. He was looking at the stars too, his expression undefended in a way it had not been earlier, the careful politeness softened by the dark and the quiet. "That's a long time to run something like this alone," she said. Yes, he said simply. He looked at her then, just briefly. Is that why you asked? Trying to understand why a man would arrange for a wife through the mail. She felt her face warm slightly. I was curious, not judging. I know you weren't. He drank from his coffee. It's a practical arrangement. Out here there aren't many, he paused, choosing the word, options for meeting someone. Most of the women in Tucson are already spoken for, or they're not the kind you marry. He said this with a matter-of-fact bluntness that was so without self-consciousness she didn't find it offensive. The arrangement made sense. Clara Weston's letters were sensible. She sounded like someone who understood what the life out here requires. She does understand practical things, Belle said honestly. She just got distracted. By love, he said, with a tone she couldn't quite read. By love, Belle agreed. The silence came back. Above them, a bat wheeled through the dark, chasing insects through the starlight. Somewhere on the hillside, one of the horses shifted and stamped. What about you? Isaac said. What are you looking for, since we're being honest? Belle turned the question over. It deserved a real answer. I don't know exactly, she said slowly. I know what I don't want. I don't want to spend my life as a dependent on someone else's charity. I want to be useful. She stopped. I want to be somewhere that has room in it. Ohio felt very small after my mother died. Everything felt very small. Room, he repeated. He glanced up at the sky. You've got plenty of that out here. Yes, she said softly. I can see that. She went to bed that night with the window open and the desert air moving through the curtains, carrying the smell of sage and dry earth, and she lay on the narrow bed under the patchwork quilt and looked at the ceiling and thought about a man with gray eyes who had held her carpet bag as though carrying it were simply the natural thing to do, and she told herself, very firmly, that she was leaving on Thursday. Thursday arrived in a complicated fashion. The morning of the first full day was straightforward enough. Belle woke early, helped Margaret with breakfast. She had always been comfortable in a kitchen, and Margaret accepted the help with a nod and no ceremony. And then, because she was not the kind of person who could sit still when there were things to be done, she asked what else she could do. Margaret put her to work darning a pile of work shirts that had accumulated near the sewing basket, and Belle sat in the main room and darned steadily while the ranch came to life around her. She could hear Hector in the yard, the horses in the barn, the distant lowing of cattle. Isaac came in from checking on the north fence line around mid-morning. He stopped when he saw her bent over the darning, her dark hair catching the light from the window, her hands moving with efficient certainty, and she looked up and caught him standing in the doorway, and something moved across his face so quickly she wasn't sure she'd seen it. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. I wanted to be useful. Margaret said these had been sitting there for a month. He crossed to the kitchen, poured himself water from the pitcher, and came back to the doorway. He leaned against the frame and watched her work, not in an uncomfortable way, but simply with the straightforward attention of a man who was genuinely interested in what he was looking at. You're good at it, he said. My mother was a school teacher, but she was also very practical. She made sure I knew how to do everything that needed doing. Belle set down one finished shirt and picked up another. She used to say that a woman who could only do pretty things was only useful in pretty situations, and life was mostly not pretty. Smart woman. The smartest I ever knew. Belle was quiet for a moment. She died of pneumonia 2 winters ago. That's when I went to Clara's. I'm sorry, he said, and it was a simple expression of sympathy without any ornamentation, which was the only kind Belle had ever found bearable. This territory is not kind to people's lungs in winter. Ohio's not either, apparently. She tied off the last stitch on the shirt in her hands and folded it. Can I ask you something, Mr. Sheridan? Isaac, he said. She looked up. He shrugged. We're not standing on formality out here, he said. The ranch hands call me Isaac. Margaret calls me Isaac. No reason you should be different. Isaac, then. She tested the name, and it settled naturally, which surprised her. What was she like? In the letters, what did she tell you about herself? He was quiet for a moment. He walked in from the doorway and sat in the chair across from her, and he looked at the floor and then at her with the careful gray eyes. She described herself as patient, he said, level-headed, good at keeping accounts. She'd worked at a school for 3 years and was comfortable with children. She liked order. He paused. She sounded like someone who would make a good partner in the management of a place like this. That's a very practical description, Belle said. It was a practical arrangement. Didn't you want more than practical? The question was more direct than she'd intended. She saw something in his face, not offense exactly, but surprise, as though someone had opened a door he'd thought was locked. I don't know that I let myself think about that, he said after a moment. Out here you learn to want what's available. Wanting what's not available is, he looked for the word, uncomfortable. Wanting what's not available, Belle said quietly, is also how people know they're alive. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, Hector called something in Spanish to one of the hands, and a horse whinnied in response. The world outside went about its business. Inside this room, something was shifting, quietly and without permission, like the slow movement of tectonic plates far below the surface. You should see the ranch while you're here, Isaac said, and stood up and picked up his hat from the table. It's a good piece of country. You came all this way, you might as well see it properly. All right, Belle said, and she set down the darning and stood up, and they went outside together into the full blaze of the Arizona morning. He showed her the ranch the way a person shows something they love, not with performance, but with the quiet, almost reverent attention of someone walking through a place that has shaped them. He showed her where the spring came up cold from the rock face on the eastern edge of the property, where a line of cottonwood trees marked the dry riverbed that ran with water 3 months of the year. He showed her the cattle, which were a mix of Texas Longhorns and Hereford stock he'd been carefully introducing to improve the meat quality for the eastern markets. He showed her the kitchen garden behind the house, which was Margaret's particular domain, and which, against all the odds of the climate, produced tomatoes and squash and dried chilies in fierce abundance. He pointed out the mountains, the Rincons to the east, the Santa Catalinas to the north, and told her their names with the affection of a man naming old friends. He told her about the monsoon season, how the summer rains came in July and August with a violence that never stopped surprising him even after 15 years, how the whole desert bloomed afterward in colors that seemed impossible, how the smell of wet creosote bush after rain was the finest smell in the world. Belle walked beside him and listened and asked questions, and somewhere around the 3rd hour of this, between the spring and the cattle pasture, she stopped walking and said, "You love it." He stopped too and looked at her. "What? This place, you love it?" She gestured at the landscape around them, the red earth, the distant blue mountains, the enormous sky. "I can hear it when you talk about it. You don't sound like a man describing a business. You sound like a man describing something he'd die for." He was quiet for a moment. Something worked in his jaw. "I suppose I would," he said. "My father and my uncle put everything into this land. I was raised on it from 19 on. He paused, looking out over the pasture, the cattle moving slow and patient in the distance. "It's the first thing that's ever been entirely mine." Belle nodded. She understood that. She had not yet found the thing that was entirely hers, but she understood the longing for it with a completeness that lived in the center of her chest, and she looked out at the land with new eyes, trying to see it the way he did, and found that she could a little. They rode the south boundary on horseback that afternoon, Isaac on his own gray gelding, Belle on a steadier bay mare named Prudence, who had apparently been selected for this purpose before, as she had the calm temperament of a creature accustomed to accommodating uncertain riders. Belle was not a confident rider. She had ridden in Ohio as a girl badly, but she was determined, and she held on and did not complain about anything. And she noticed that Isaac rode close enough to assist if she needed it without making her feel watched or managed. They were coming back along the fence line, the long shadows of late afternoon stretching ahead of them, when the gray gelding shied suddenly at something in the brush. Isaac checked the horse easily, but the movement startled Prudence, who lurched sideways, and for one bad moment Belle was not entirely on the horse. She grabbed the saddle horn with both hands and brought herself back upright by pure determination, and then let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Isaac was already beside her, his horse pressed close, his hand reaching out and then stopping, hovering without touching, his expression asking the question his voice hadn't gotten to yet. "I'm all right," she said. Her voice was steady, which impressed even herself. "There's a rattlesnake in that brush," he said. "Horses don't like them." "I should have warned you. I'll remember for next time," she said, and then immediately wondered why she had said next time as though there would be one. He looked at her, and his hand, which had been hovering in midair, came to rest briefly on her arm, just below the elbow, a steadying contact that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and then was gone. But she felt the warmth of it through the fabric of her sleeve, and she kept her eyes on the road ahead and said nothing. They did not talk much on the ride back. They didn't need to. That evening, after supper, Hector played guitar on the bunkhouse steps in the cooling dark. A slow, melancholy Mexican song that drifted through the yard in the evening air. Belle sat on the porch steps again, listening, and Isaac sat in his chair above her, and neither of them spoke for a long time, but the silence had changed since last night. It was warmer now. It held something. "She was never real to you, was she?" Belle said quietly. "Who?" "Clara, Miss Weston, the woman in the letters." Belle was watching the stars come out, one by one, in the deepening sky. "You made an arrangement, and you corresponded carefully, and you were very proper about all of it, but you never—" She paused, feeling for the right words. "She never made you feel anything. She was just a practical solution to a practical problem." The pause was long enough that she wondered if she had said too much. "That's an honest observation," Isaac said finally. "I told you I was given to thinking too much." "You were right." He was quiet again. She heard him set down his coffee cup on the arm of the chair. 4 months of letters, and I can't tell you one thing about her that wasn't logistical, what she was good at, what she was willing to do." He paused. "I couldn't tell you what she thought about stars." Belle looked up at the stars. "What do you think about stars?" "I think they make a person honest," he said. "Too much space and too much light to stay comfortable in a lie." She thought about that. "I think they're lonely," she said, "each one of them burning by itself so far away from every other one. I think the fact that they're beautiful doesn't make them any less alone." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a sad way to think about it." "I've been a sad person sometimes," she said simply. "I'm not always, but I have been." "What made you sad?" She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that direct, undefended attention again, the attention that seemed to require honesty in return. "My mother dying," she said, "and then finding out that without her I wasn't necessary to anyone, that I was a convenience. A spare person that other people found useful to have around sometimes and inconvenient other times." Something moved in his face. "You're not that," he said. "You've known me a day and a half," she pointed out. "That's long enough to know some things," he said. He picked up his coffee cup again, looked at it, set it back down. "Long enough to know that the woman who showed up at that train station with the courage to tell me she wasn't who I was expecting, who spent the afternoon learning to ride better instead of making excuses, who asked questions about stars and cattle with equal interest, that woman is not a spare person." Belle's throat tightened. She looked back at the stars before he could see her face. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm not saying it to be kind," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true." She pressed her lips together and breathed and looked at the stars and felt something begin to come loose inside her chest, something she had kept very tightly fastened for a very long time. Wednesday arrived with a clarity that felt almost accusatory. Belle was up before dawn, helping Margaret with the morning bread, her hands working the dough on the cool stone surface with a rhythm that helped her think. Margaret worked beside her in comfortable silence for a long while and then, without preamble, said, "You're not planning to stay?" "I'm leaving on Thursday's train," Belle said. "That was the plan." "Whose plan?" Belle pushed the heels of her hands into the dough. "The only sensible one. He arranged for someone else. I'm not her." He arranged for a practical solution, Margaret said, in the tone of someone who had been observing something for some time and had decided to say it aloud. He got something else entirely. The question is whether he's smart enough to know the difference. She cut Belle a sharp look. The question is whether you are. Margaret, Belle said. I'm not telling you what to do, the older woman said crisply. I'm telling you what I see. I've been in this house for 11 years, and I have watched that man run this place with everything he has and give nothing to himself that wasn't strictly necessary. And I have watched him write letters to a woman he would never have loved because he had decided love was a luxury he couldn't afford. She shaped her loaves with practiced efficiency. And then I watched him yesterday, riding the south boundary with you, and he came back a different color. Belle stopped kneading. A different color. Alive, Margaret said. He came back looking alive. She went to put the loaves in the oven, and Belle stood at the stone counter with her hands still pressed flat in the dough and felt the full, impossible weight of the situation. She was still thinking about it when Isaac came to find her after breakfast, hat in his hand again. She noticed he did that, brought his hat with him when he was going to say something he hadn't fully decided on yet. I want to show you something, he said, if you're willing. He took her on horseback to the eastern edge of the property, where the land rose gently toward the base of the Rincon Mountains. There was a place there where the rock face had been worn by centuries of water into a series of shallow basins, and in the dry season they held rainwater long after the desert everywhere else had gone thirsty. In the morning light, with the mountains rising behind it and the desert spreading below, it was one of the most beautiful places Belle had ever seen. There were rock paintings on the stone face nearby, ancient images in ochre and white, handprints and animals and spiraling shapes that meant something she couldn't read but felt the significance of anyway. Apache, Isaac said, looking at the paintings. He said the word with a respect that was not common in what Belle had heard of how white settlers talked about the Apache people. Or older. Hector's grandfather told him some of these are very old, from people who were here long before anyone living now can remember. Belle reached out and let her fingers hover just above the painted handprint, not quite touching. Someone had pressed their hand to this rock, long ago, and made a mark that said I was here. I existed. She understood that impulse with every part of herself. I come here when I need to think, Isaac said. He was standing slightly behind her, looking at the paintings. Something about the scale of it, how old it all is, makes most of the things I'm worried about seem manageable. What are you worried about now? She asked. The question was quiet. She turned to face him. He was closer than she'd realized because they'd both been looking at the paintings. He was looking at her now, and his expression was the most open she had seen it, all the careful practical management of his face entirely set aside, and what was underneath was something she had no defenses against at all. I'm worried about Thursday, he said. The desert was perfectly still around them. The mountains watched. I am too, she said. He reached out and she thought he was going to touch her face, but instead he took her hand. Both hands wrapped around hers with the same absolute steadiness she had felt the first time he'd helped her up into the wagon, and he looked at her with those gray morning sky eyes and said, Don't go. Belle's breath caught. Isaac, I know it's not what was arranged, he said. I know I'm asking you to stay in a place you didn't choose, with a man you didn't agree to, in a life that's considerably harder than most. He held her hand and did not look away. I know I've known you barely 2 days, and I know that's not enough for most people. But I have been a careful, practical man my whole life, and I have made sensible arrangements, and I have not let myself want things I didn't think I could have. And I am standing here looking at you in this light with this country behind you, and I cannot make the argument that you should leave because the argument doesn't hold. Belle looked at him for a long time. She looked at the paintings behind him, and the mountains, and the ancient water basins holding what rain they'd caught, and the desert going gold in the morning light. She thought about the spare room in Clara's house, and the train station and the long hollow year after her mother died when she had felt herself slowly disappearing. She thought about stars burning alone in the dark. "You need to know something first," she said, "before you ask me to stay. Tell me." "I am not patient," she said. "Not in the way the letter described. I am determined and I work hard and I don't quit, but I am not mild-tempered. I have opinions about nearly everything, and I'm likely to tell you what they are even when you haven't asked. I'm not experienced at ranch life, and I will make mistakes for a long time before I'm anything resembling competent at it. I am not neat, I am organized, which is different. And I am sad sometimes, and when I'm sad, I need to be alone with it for a while before I can talk about it." She held his gaze. "I am not the woman that letter described, not even slightly." He looked at her. And then, very slowly, something happened to his face that she had not yet seen, something that transformed the careful gray-eyed steadiness of him into something warmer, something that moved from his mouth upward, a real, unhurried, completely unguarded smile. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I am glad." She blinked. "You're glad?" "That letter," he said, still holding her hand, his thumb moving once across her knuckles, "did not make me feel like this." Something opened in her chest, wide and warm and terrifying and exactly right. She looked at him for one more long moment, and she thought that this was what it felt like to be standing in the right place at the right time, which she had not known before, and which she understood now was an almost unbearably rare and precious thing. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll stay." He exhaled slowly, and she felt the steadiness of him as a warmth that moved through the contact of their joined hands and into her. He lifted her hand briefly, just for a moment, and pressed his mouth to the back of her knuckles, formal and gentle and full of something that made her look away for the sheer force of it. They stood there for a moment longer in the ancient, painted place, and the mountains watched over them, and the desert was very still and full of light. They rode back to the ranch with the morning brightening ahead of them, and Belle felt the horse under her and the sun on her face and the land opening in every direction, and thought, "This is mine now. This is where I begin." Thursday came and went without anyone going to the train station. Margaret said nothing about this. She simply set a fourth place at the table that evening and made a point of asking Belle's opinion on the proper ratio of dried chilies to beans, which was Margaret's version of a warm welcome. Hector glanced at Isaac across the supper table with an expression that said something in Spanish too brief and complicated for Belle to catch, and Isaac looked at his plate and did not smile, but the line of his shoulders was different. The days that followed were full and demanding and occasionally overwhelming, and Belle was grateful for every single one of them. She threw herself into the work of the ranch with a ferocity that surprised even herself. There was more to learn than she had anticipated, not just the cooking and the household management, which she was reasonably competent at from the start, but everything else. The feeding and watering schedules for the animals, the territory's water laws and grazing rights, which were complicated and contentious. The cattle records, which Isaac kept in a system she needed a week to fully understand, but which she then improved without being asked, reorganizing the entries in a way that made the records at once cleaner and more useful. He found her doing this one evening, spread across the dining table with 3 years of ledgers and a new approach to the columns, and he stood in the doorway and looked at what she'd done and said, with quiet admiration, "Hector's been trying to make sense of those records for 2 years. Your original system made sense as a personal record," she said, not looking up from the page, "but not as a business record. You need to be able to show a banker or a buyer the actual returns at a glance." She turned the open ledger toward him, like this. He came in and looked at what she'd done, standing beside her at the table, close enough that she could smell the particular combination of sun and leather and wood smoke that she was already beginning to associate entirely with him. He studied the columns. "You know accounting," he said. "My mother kept the school's accounts. She taught me." Belle looked up and found him very close. "Do you mind? I should have asked before rearranging things." "No," he said, looking at her rather than the ledger. "I don't mind." Learning to ride properly was a project. She asked Hector to teach her, correctly identifying him as a better and more patient instructor than Isaac, who was too invested in her safety to be a dispassionate teacher. Hector taught her with the systematic efficiency of a man who had been breaking horses since boyhood, and by the end of the second week, she could manage prudence at a canter and had stopped grabbing the saddle horn at unexpected movements. By the end of the third week, she was riding with something that could be called confidence, if not yet elegance. The territory itself was teaching her things that no one was instructing her indirectly. She learned the names of plants, the ocotillo and the palo verde and the brittle bush and the saguaro, and then learned their uses, because nothing in this landscape was merely decorative. Everything had a purpose and a history. She learned to read the weather in the quality of the light on the mountains. She learned that the desert was not empty, had never been empty, was in fact full to the edges with life that simply operated differently than Ohio life, on different schedules and at different intensities. She and Isaac fell into a pattern that felt, from almost the beginning, as though it had always existed. Mornings were work, she in the house and the kitchen garden, sometimes out on the range with him if the task was one she could help with. Afternoons she spent on whatever project was most pressing, which was frequently the accounts. Evenings after supper were theirs. They sat on the porch or walked the yard in the cooling air, and they talked about everything and about nothing, with the easy-ranging quality of two people who were genuinely interested in each other's minds. She told him about her mother, about the woman Belle Hayes had been, fierce and funny and deeply principled, who had taught school for 20 years in a town that paid her less than the male teachers, and had simply worked harder than all of them and never once complained, who had raised Belle alone and made her feel never once like a burden. Isaac listened to these stories with complete attention, and occasionally said something so precisely right that she had to stop and look at him to be sure she'd heard correctly. He told her, slowly and in pieces, about his father, a harder man, a man who had built things but not always tended them, who had loved the land with a passion that left less room for people. He told her about growing up between Texas and the territory, about the years of learning everything the hard way, about the particular loneliness of being responsible for a large operation with no one to share the weight of the decisions. He did not say these things as complaints. He said them as facts, as the shape of his life, but she heard beneath the facts the long quietness of them, and she understood. 3 weeks in, during a stretch of September heat so complete and enveloping that even the cattle seemed to have opinions about it, there was a problem with the north fence that required several days of work in the full sun, and Belle rode out with the hands to help. This was not expected of her, and Isaac told her so. She told him that she understood, she just didn't agree, and handed him a canteen and got on her horse. Hector made a small sound that she was coming to recognize as his version of approval. The fence work was brutal in the heat. Posts to be reset, wire to be stretched and stapled, sections to be replaced entirely where the last monsoon had washed out the ground underneath. The workers herself, Isaac, Hector, and 2 of the hands, Jimmy Morse and young Tom Alcott, who was barely 18, and seemed perpetually astonished that the boss's intended could work as hard, as she did, moved steadily down the fence line in the white light of the afternoon. And nobody talked much because it was too hot to talk. And at the end of the day, they came home dusty and sore and went about the business of washing up and supper with the quiet solidarity of people who had done hard work together. That night Belle's arms ached from the fence work, and she sat on the porch steps working her hands together, trying to loosen the muscles, and Isaac came out with a small tin that contained, he explained simply, a salve Margaret made from desert plants, good for muscle strain. He held it out to her. She took it. Their hands didn't touch, but they nearly did, and she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and something between them had the quality of a conversation happening entirely without words. "You didn't have to come out there today," he said again quietly. "I know," she said equally quietly. "I wanted to be useful." "You are useful," he said. He stopped. He sat down in his chair and looked out at the dark. "You've done more for this place in 3 weeks than I've managed alone in 2 years. That's not true. "The accounts," he said. "The fence work. The kitchen garden, which Margaret says has never been this productive. The understanding you've given Tom Alcott about how to read the water table signs, which I told him 3 times and he never retained until you explained it differently." "Tom's not stupid, he just learns visually," Belle said, a little defensively on Tom's behalf. "You have to show him, not tell him." "I know that now," Isaac said, and there was the smile again, brief and warm. "Because you told me." She rubbed the salve into her forearms and looked at the stars and said, "I like it here." "I'm glad," he said. She looked at him. "I mean, I really like it, not just because I have nowhere else to go. I mean, I wake up in the morning and I want to see what the day is going to be. I want to know about the water table and the cattle and what Hector thinks about the weather. I want to know what the mountains look like in the rain." She paused. "I've never felt that way about a place before." "That's how I've always felt about it," he said. "But it's different hearing it from someone else." "Better or worse?" "Better," he said without hesitation. "Considerably better." October came in on a cooler wind, and with it, a problem that had been building at the edges of the territory for months. There had been land disputes in the area for years. The complicated, painful aftermath of land that had belonged to Apache families and to Mexican families under Spanish land grants. Land that had been taken and retaken and claimed, and contested through a history of violence and injustice that was still very much alive in the present. Belle had learned about this gradually, from Hector and from what she observed, and she had understood from early on that the ease of her own position arriving from Ohio and being able to stay on a ranch simply because a white man invited her was not something universal in this territory, not something all people had access to equally, and this troubled her in a way she didn't try to suppress. The specific problem that arrived in October concerned a neighboring rancher named Gerald Pryor, who had been pushing his cattle onto the southern edge of the Sheridan grazing land for 2 seasons, making use of the spring that Isaac had showed Belle on her first day. The Sheridan land was clearly deeded. Isaac had the papers, everything proper, but Pryor was the kind of man who operated on a principle of what he could get away with rather than what was legal, and he had friends on the county commission who made certain disputes easy to delay. Isaac had been managing this with steady patience, which Belle could see was costing him more than he let on. When she pressed him on it one evening, he explained the full situation: the papers, the commission delays, the fence cut on the south line that they both knew was Pryor's doing even without proof. His voice was even and controlled, but his hands around his coffee cup were not. "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" Belle asked. "Lawyers cost money and take time, and Pryor knows that," he said. "Have you spoken to Judge Harmon in Tucson?" She had heard Hector mention Judge Harmon as a man of genuine integrity, which was not common. "Hector said he's straight." Isaac looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks," she said. "And I think you should take the deed and the survey records and your fence repair logs, which I've been keeping since I got here, by the way, and go see Judge Harmon directly before the winter delays everything another season." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been keeping fence repair logs?" "Every time a fence came in for repair, I noted the location, the nature of the damage, and the date," she said. 3 months of that, showing consistent damage to the south line, is evidence of a pattern. It won't prove Pryor's responsible, but it demonstrates something that a county commission has to answer for." He set down his coffee cup very carefully. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was somewhere between stunned and something so warm it made her look away for a moment. "Belle," he said. "Don't look at me like that," she said, somewhat flustered. "It was just an obvious thing to do." "It was not an obvious thing," he said. "I should have been doing it myself." He paused. "Will you come with me to Tucson when I go to see Harmon? If you want me there." "I want you there," he said simply. They went to Tucson on the 2nd Thursday of October, taking the wagon in the morning and arriving by noon. Judge Harmon's office was in the back of the territorial courthouse, a solidly built adobe structure that smelled of paper and lamp oil and the particular gravity of small official spaces. Harmon himself was a compact, white-haired man of perhaps 60, with the kind of steady eyes that came from years of looking at human behavior and forming careful opinions about it. Belle presented the fence logs. Isaac presented the deed and the survey records. Harmon listened to all of it with complete attention, asked several pointed questions, many of which Belle answered because she had the logs in front of her and the details at hand, and then sat back and looked at them both. "This is well documented," he said, with slight emphasis on the word that suggested he found it uncommon. He glanced at Belle. "Your wife put these together." Isaac paused almost imperceptibly. Belle felt her face warm slightly. "Miss Hayes keeps my records," he said. Harmon looked between them with the calm of a man who was not going to comment on what he observed. "I'll issue a notice to Pryor requiring him to demonstrate legal basis for access to your spring. If he can't, which I don't believe he can, you'll have formal documentation to present to the commission, and I'll have a quiet word with Commissioner Davis, who I believe has been persuaded to see things in a particular way that I find professionally inconvenient." He said this with a dry precision that suggested Commissioner Davis was going to find October complicated. "Come back in 2 weeks." Walking out of the courthouse, Belle felt Isaac's hand come to the small of her back, a light, brief contact, entirely proper, guiding her through the doorway, and she looked straight ahead and breathed carefully and thought about practical things until her pulse settled. They had lunch at the hotel before the long drive back. A small, good meal of roasted chicken and biscuits that was better than the hotel's general reputation suggested. They sat across from each other in the dining room, and Isaac ordered coffee and she ordered tea, and they talked about Harmon and Pryor and the commission, and then they talked about the winter cattle market and the price of wire, and then they talked about nothing in particular, and somewhere in the middle of talking about nothing in particular, Isaac said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. "Are you happy?" She looked at him. Outside the dining room windows, Tucson went about its business wagons on the main street, boot heels on the boardwalk, the distant sound of a piano from somewhere on the far end of town. "Yes," she said, "more than I expected to be. More than I thought I was entitled to." "You're entitled to it," he said. "Isaac." She folded her hands on the table. She had been careful these weeks to be honest without being reckless, but there was something pressing against the inside of her chest that had been there since the second day, since the water basins and the painted handprints, and she thought that if she didn't say it she would simply carry it forever, and that seemed like a waste. "You know that what I feel, what I have felt, since almost the beginning of this is not anything I planned or expected." "I know," he said. His hands were on the table too, close to hers but not touching. "I know because I feel the same way, and I have been trying to decide how to say so without it being premature or overwhelming." Or he stopped. He was not a man who struggled for words, and his struggling now told her everything. "I have been trying to say it in the right order," he said. "You said you were someone who thought too much and acted too late. I am the same, and I don't want to be that person in this particular situation." Belle looked at his hands on the table. She turned one of hers over, palm up, the smallest possible gesture. He looked at it. He placed his hand over hers, his fingers folding gently around it, and looked at her across the table in the mild midday light of the hotel dining room, and everything was very simple and very clear. "I love you," he said, quietly and directly, the way he said everything. "I think I began to love you the moment you stood on that platform and told me the truth when you didn't have to, because it was the braver and harder thing." Belle's breath came slowly. The thing in her chest opened all the way, warm and vast, and she understood, for the first time in her adult life, what it felt like to be known and chosen simultaneously. "I love you too," she said, equally quiet. "I have been trying not to say it for weeks because it seemed like something that could make everything complicated." "Does it? Make things complicated?" "No," she said. "It makes everything simpler." He squeezed her hand once, gentle and certain, and they sat in the dining room with their hands together and the afternoon light on the table between them, and outside the town went about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that something extraordinary had just settled quietly into place. He proposed formally on a Saturday morning in November, in the kitchen garden, while she was bringing in the last of the dried chilies before the cold could get them. He had the ring his mother had left him, a plain gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, which was not a traditional Eastern style but was exactly right for this place and for him. And he got down on one knee in the dirt of the garden, which she told him afterward was absolutely unnecessary. And he said that it was necessary, actually, that some things deserved the proper ceremony regardless of the setting. She said yes. She said it before he'd finished the question, which made him laugh in that brief, genuine way that she had been collecting carefully since the beginning. And she pulled him up from the garden dirt, and he kissed her for the first time, his hands cupping her face with a reverence and a warmth that she felt from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. And the Arizona morning was brilliant around them, and the mountains watched, and the windmill turned in the November breeze. And everything was exactly as it should be. Margaret, when told, said, "Well, it's about time," and went back to the stove. Hector shook Isaac's hand and then very formally shook Belle's hand and said, "I am glad for both of you." And this was one of the longest speeches Belle had ever heard from him, and she knew it for the profound endorsement it was. Tom Alcott, who was still perpetually astonished by most things, said, "You're getting married. That's really something, ma'am," and looked pleased in an uncomplicated way that Belle found deeply charming. They were married in December, in the church that had still been under construction when Belle arrived and which was finished now, on a morning when the air was cold enough to show your breath, and the mountains had caps of snow on them, and the sky was the particular brilliant blue of winter in the Arizona territory, which was different from summer blue, deeper, thinner, edged with something crystalline. Margaret had made Belle a dress from fabric they'd ordered from Tucson in a blue-gray that was, in fact, the precise color of Isaac's eyes, which was not something Belle had planned, and which she absolutely did not mention. The minister was a young, earnest man named Reverend Callum, who was from Massachusetts and still slightly uncertain about the desert but was finding his footing. The witnesses were Margaret and Hector. The church was small and cool and smelled of new wood and candle wax. When Isaac took her hands at the altar and looked at her, he looked at her the way he looked at the land, with the love of someone who had put everything into something and found it returned, multiplied, in ways he couldn't have predicted. Belle held his hands and felt the ring slide onto her finger and thought of the train platform in September and of Clara's letter in her pocket, and of all the accidental and necessary steps that had led from there to here. And she thought that perhaps Tuesday was not such a bad day after all. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at the ranch. Margaret had made enough food for 3 times their number, and Hector played guitar in the evening, and Tom Alcott danced with a complete and cheerful lack of skill, and the fire in the main room cast everything in warm gold, and outside, the winter stars were out in their millions, burning clear and cold and impossibly bright. Belle stood on the porch in the cold, looking up at them, her coat pulled close. She felt Isaac come to stand behind her, his arms coming around her shoulders, pulling her back against him, warm and steady and present. "Still lonely," he said quietly near her ear. She thought about what she had said months ago, sitting on these same steps, that the stars were each one burning alone, beautiful and isolated. She looked up at them now and found that she saw them differently. Not lonely. Just themselves, entirely, burning exactly as bright as they were, in their proper place in the sky. "No," she said, "not anymore." He pressed a kiss to her temple and she leaned into his warmth and looked at the winter stars over Arizona, and the land around them was dark and vast and full of life, and everything was as it should be. The winter that followed was the hardest season Belle had yet experienced in the territory, which she had been warned about, and which was still harder than the warnings suggested. January brought a cold that was not the deep, wet cold of Ohio, but rather a dry, piercing cold that moved through walls and clothing alike, and with it came a sickness in part of the herd, a respiratory illness that killed 3 animals and threatened more before Isaac and Hector and Belle, working together, managed to identify and contain it. It was during this crisis that Belle understood something she had known intellectually but not yet felt in her bones: the sheer, continuous difficulty of this life. The nights up checking the sick cattle, wrapped in everything she owned, the cold lamp in the dark barn with Isaac's voice low and steady beside her, both of them exhausted and worried and refusing to show it to each other until they were alone and could admit it. She understood now what he had meant by the long aloneness of running something like this, not because it was still alone, but because it was relentless, and relentless things required a particular kind of strength that she was discovering she had. When the crisis passed, and the remaining herd was declared healthy by the veterinarian who came out from Tucson in February, Isaac sat down at the kitchen table at 9 in the morning and put his face in his hands and let out a long breath that contained the entirety of 6 weeks of worry. Belle sat beside him and put her hand on his back and said nothing, because nothing was required. After a moment, he straightened and looked at her, and what was in his face was so unguarded and grateful and entirely hers that she leaned over and pressed her forehead against his temple, just briefly, and then stood up and put the kettle on, because the practical thing after a hard night was coffee. The prior matter resolved itself in February as well. Judge Harmon had been as good as his word, and Commissioner Davis had apparently found October and November and December quite complicated indeed, because when Pryor was formally presented with the documentation and the notice, he retracted his claim on the spring access and moved his cattle off the southern boundary. He did this with the visible bad grace of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted, and Isaac received the news with a quietness that was not gloating, but rather the straightforward satisfaction of a man who had done things correctly and been vindicated for it. That evening, when Belle looked up from the account she was updating to reflect the resolution of the dispute, she found Isaac watching her from across the room with the expression she had come to recognize as the one she loved best, warm and direct and entirely present, as though she was the most interesting thing in the world. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." "You look," she said, "the same way you look at the land." "I know," he said. "That's how I know it's real." Spring came like a relief, like the entire territory exhaling. The desert bloomed after the winter rains, not the extravagant explosion of the summer monsoon season that Belle had not yet witnessed, but would quietly and in small, fierce colors, yellow brittlebush and purple desert lavender, and the spectacular pink red of the Ocotillo. Belle walked the property in the mornings before the heat came, learning its spring face, adding it to the catalog of faces she was accumulating. She was 3 months pregnant by March, which she discovered with a combination of joy and terror that she told Isaac about on a Tuesday evening, which meant, she noted, that the jinx on Tuesdays was officially broken. He sat very still for a moment when she told him, and then he reached across the table and took her hand with both of his and held it for a long moment without speaking, and then he said, "Are you all right?" Because that was Isaac, the first question was always about her. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "A little tired, but I was tired anyway." He lifted her hand and pressed it to his face, holding it against his cheek, his eyes closed for a moment. "Good," he said, in a voice that was not entirely steady. "That's good." Margaret was told the next morning and immediately began reorganizing the household schedule in ways that assumed Belle would need to rest more, which Belle resisted, and Margaret overruled with a serene authority that brooked no argument. Hector heard the news and went very quiet in the way that meant he was moved. Tom Alcott said, "That's really something, ma'am," which was apparently his response to all significant life events, and Belle was very fond of him for it. The months that followed were busy and warm and good. Belle's energy returned fully by April, and she worked as hard as she ever had, though she conceded to writing less and accounting more, and she conceded this without any great drama because she was not foolish. The accounts had grown into a project she was genuinely proud of. She had begun doing the bookkeeping for 2 neighboring ranches as well, at their request, for a modest fee that she saved with some vague idea about the future. She wrote to Clara in April. It was not an easy letter to write, but she wrote it honestly, describing the ranch and the territory and Isaac without embellishment. And at the end she said that she bore no ill will, and that in a strange way she supposed Clara had done her the greatest favor of her life without meaning to. Clara wrote back from Denver, where she was now Mrs. Clara Hartley, sounding exactly like herself, breathless and warm and a little guilty still. And the correspondence became a regular thing, which was something Belle was glad of because Clara was the only family she had. The summer monsoon arrived in July with the violence Isaac had described: sudden, enormous, electrically charged storms that came up from the south in the afternoons, with a speed that was almost frightening, and dropped such quantities of rain in such short periods of time that the dry washes filled and roared, and the whole desert was transformed overnight into something green and improbable. Belle stood on the covered porch in the first great monsoon storm of the season and watched the lightning walk across the mountains and the rain drive at the desert floor, and the saguaro stand patient and unbothered under it all. And she thought that this was the most alive she had ever felt in her body, the pure electricity of the storm pressing against the edges of her skin. Isaac stood beside her with his arms around her from behind, one hand resting on her rounded belly, his chin near her temple, watching the storm with her. "What do you think?" he said. "I think," she said, "that this is the finest thing I have ever seen." "Wait until tomorrow," he said, "when everything blooms." He was right. The morning after the first monsoon storm, the ranch and the country around it were transformed, everything washed clean and vividly colored, the air sharp with the smell of creosote and wet earth, and in every direction, flowers appearing on plants that had seemed entirely dormant, as though the whole desert had been waiting and was now answering, as though the rain were a question and the blooming were the answer. Belle walked out into it in the early morning, before the heat came back, and stood in the wet desert air with the mountains shining ahead of her, and thought of her mother, and of how much Belle Hayes would have loved this place. And she felt the grief of that with a clean ache that was no longer the old hollow pain, but something softer, something that could coexist with joy. Their son was born in October, on a clear autumn morning, with the sky just the color that Belle had come to associate with the best of this country, that deep, brilliant desert blue with not a cloud anywhere. The birth was attended by a midwife from Tucson named Rosa Garza, a calm and capable woman who had, she told Belle placidly, assisted at over 200 births in the territory and had seen everything and was not concerned about anything. This confidence was enormously comforting. Isaac was not permitted in the room for the birth, which was the custom, but he remained in the hallway outside for the entirety of it, which Rosa Garza told him was unnecessary, and which he did anyway. Belle could hear him out there occasionally, pacing with a quiet, steady tread, and she found this so exactly characteristic of him that in between the harder moments she was almost amused. The boy came into the world with a strong voice and a full head of dark hair, and his father's chin already firmly in evidence. Belle held him and felt the full, staggering weight of this new love, different from what she felt for Isaac, but connected to it, issuing from the same source, from the same decision to be present in her life instead of peripheral to it. Isaac was brought in. He stood at the side of the bed and looked at the baby and then at Belle, and his face was so completely transparent, so entirely undone by love and relief and something she could only call wonder, that she reached up and took his hand. "He has your eyes," she said. The baby's eyes were the particular gray of early morning sky. Isaac sat on the edge of the bed, careful, and looked at his son with an expression Belle knew she would keep for the rest of her life. "What do we call him?" he said softly. They had discussed names inconclusively. Belle looked at the baby and thought about what she wanted this boy to carry forward. "James," she said, "after your father." Isaac's father had been a hard man, she knew, but he had also been a man who built things, who came west and planted himself in difficult soil and grew something lasting. She saw Isaac consider this, the offer of something generous that he hadn't asked for, and she watched him accept it with the particular grace of a man who had learned to receive things as well as give them. "James," he said. He looked at her. "James Sheridan." "James Sheridan," she agreed. James was a vigorous, direct, opinionated baby who from his first weeks made his preferences known in unmistakable terms, which struck everyone who knew his parents as entirely predictable. Margaret took one look at him and declared that he had his mother's temperament and his father's stubbornness, and the combination was going to be interesting. Hector held him with the careful tenderness of a man holding something precious and said quietly that he had a strong face, and that strong faces in this country were useful. Tom Alcott said, "That's really something, ma'am," while staring at the baby with a look of pure, baffled wonder, and then said, "He's real small," which was true and made Belle laugh, which she needed. The winter of James's first year was easier than the previous winter had been. Less illness in the herd, the prior dispute long settled, the accounts in better shape than they had been in years. Belle managed the household and the books from a slightly reduced physical range than she was accustomed to, but she managed them no less thoroughly. Isaac took on more of the direct ranch work with an energy she recognized as the particular vitality of a man who was deeply happy, and she watched him sometimes from the porch or the kitchen window, long and capable in the saddle against the desert landscape, and felt a private, fierce gratitude for the accidental chain of events that had brought her to this precise place. James's first word, at 11 months, was water, spoken very clearly and directly at the water basin in the kitchen, which Belle found entirely appropriate. His second word was horse, which was less surprising given his environment. His third word was light, spoken early one morning when the winter sun came through the bedroom window and caught him full in the face, and he turned toward it with his father's gray eyes, and said it with a certainty that suggested he was identifying something he had been waiting to name. In the spring, when James was walking with the careful, determined concentration of a new walker, Belle discovered she was expecting again. She told Isaac in the kitchen garden in the morning, the same place he had proposed, which seemed appropriate. He reacted differently this second time, quicker, more immediately joyful, less awed and stunned than he had been the first time, as though now he knew what to expect and could simply be glad without the vertigo. He pulled her into his arms and held her, which was better, she thought, than either of them sitting perfectly still. The accounting business had grown, by the second spring, into something that required a proper part of her week. She had taken on 4 neighboring ranches, and was in preliminary conversations with a cattle broker in Tucson who wanted his records managed. Isaac had made space in the main room for a proper desk, and she worked there in the mornings with James playing at her feet, and she thought sometimes about her mother teaching school in a town that paid her less than the men and working harder than all of them, and she thought that this was her version of that, finding the work she was built for and doing it with everything she had in the place where she belonged. She wrote to Clara regularly. Clara was now expecting her first child and was very alarmed about it in a way that made her letters entertaining, and Belle wrote back with practical reassurance and the kind of honesty that only existed between women who had known each other since childhood. Clara's letters were full of Denver life. The salesman husband who was, apparently, both charming and unreliable, though mostly reliable in the important things, and they made Belle appreciate with a quiet, steady gratitude the specific shape of what she had. Late in the second spring, on a warm evening when the desert was still full from the winter rains, and everything was green in that brief, impossible way it was green before the summer heat arrived, Belle sat on the porch steps with James asleep against her shoulder, his dark head tucked under her chin, his breathing deep and even. The stars were coming out above the saguaros, One by one, the same stars she had looked at on her first night here when she had said they were lonely. Isaac came out and sat in his chair behind her, and after a moment he said, very quietly, so as not to wake James, "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the stars. She thought about the train station in September 2 years ago, and the letter in her pocket, and a woman named Clara Weston who had not come, and a man with gray eyes who had held her carpetbag, and said that the next train east wasn't until Thursday. She thought about the ancient handprints on the rock face, and the monsoon storms, and the kitchen garden, and the fence logs, and Judge Harmon, and the cold nights in the barn, and the morning James was born. She thought about two people who had each been in their own way alone for a long time, burning by themselves in the dark, and who had found each other by complete accident on a train platform in the blazing Arizona heat, and she thought that perhaps accident was not the right word. Perhaps the right word was necessary. Perhaps some things were necessary, and the world arranged for them in its own way and on its own time, and all you had to do was tell the truth when you arrived. "I'm thinking," she said softly, "about Tuesdays." He was quiet for a moment. "Tuesdays?" She smiled, looking at the stars. "Never mind, it's a private joke." She tilted her head back slightly to look at him over her shoulder. "I'm thinking about how glad I am," she said. "How entirely, completely, embarrassingly glad." He reached forward and his hand came to rest on the top of her head, gentle, and slid to her shoulder and stayed there. "So am I," he said. Below them, Tucson was 40 miles away. Above them, the stars were out in their millions, burning with their full and generous light, every one of them precisely in its place. The desert was alive in the dark, rustling and calling and breathing in its nighttime way, full of everything it held, all the life that the casual eye missed and that the careful eye found everywhere. The windmill turned in the evening breeze. The mountains were dark shapes against the darker sky, immovable and patient as they had always been. James stirred against Belle's shoulder, a small murmur, and settled back into sleep without waking. She pressed a kiss to the top of his head and felt Isaac's hand steady on her shoulder and felt the next child moving gently, and thought that the stars were not lonely at all. They never had been. They were each exactly what they were, burning exactly as bright as they were capable of burning, in the place they were meant to be. The letter that had started all of it, Clara's letter, the letter describing a different woman for a different life, was still in Belle's bedside drawer. She had kept it. She was not sure why she had kept it, until one evening she had understood. It was proof of what did not happen, a record of the path not taken, and she needed it not as a reminder of what she had narrowly missed, but as a marker of where she had actually arrived. Every now and then she took it out and read it, the careful description of a patient, steady, mild-tempered woman with experience in household management, and she thought, with enormous affection for the gap between what had been arranged and what had actually occurred, that life was considerably better at this sort of thing than any of the people in it. She was not that woman. She had never been that woman. She was Belle Hayes Sheridan, who had opinions about everything and said so, who kept meticulous accounts and fixed fences in the heat, and could now ride at a full gallop across the south boundary without grabbing the saddle horn, who had walked into a stranger's house with a carpetbag and a confession, and found the fullest life she had ever imagined. And the man who had arranged for someone else and gotten her instead had stood in the kitchen garden with a ring from his mother and gotten down in the dirt and said that he was glad. She had asked him once, much later, what he had meant by that. He had thought about it for a moment, the way he thought about everything carefully, without hurry. Then he had said that the woman in the letter had seemed entirely adequate, a good arrangement, sensible. He had read those letters and felt a kind of mild, practical relief. Nothing had shifted in him, nothing had moved. "And then you stood on that platform," he said, "and you told me the truth you didn't have to tell me, and something moved, something that had been still for a very long time." He paused. "The woman in that letter never made me feel like that," he looked for the word, like the whole landscape had changed. Like something I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting had finally arrived. Belle had not said anything for a moment. Then she had picked up his hand and held it, and they had sat together in the way they had sat together 100 times by then, easy and close and full of something that neither of them needed to articulate because it was simply present, simply there, as constant as the mountains and as certain as the morning. The second baby arrived in November, 3 weeks early but entirely healthy. A boy again, compact and loud, with his mother's dark hair and a pair of lungs that immediately established themselves as a formidable feature. James, who was now 18 months old and had a great many opinions about most things, peered into the cradle at his new brother with an expression of intense, concentrated assessment, and then looked at Belle and said "mine," which was incorrect from a technical standpoint but accurate in spirit. They named him William, which was Belle's father's name, the father she had never known, but whose name she had found in her mother's Bible in the margins, written with a care that suggested he had been loved even in his absence. Isaac had suggested it, remembering that she had mentioned it once, months ago, in passing, and she had looked at him when he said it and been unable to speak for a moment because he had kept that, had held on to something she'd said once in passing and brought it back as a gift. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember everything you tell me," he said simply. And that was Isaac, entirely and completely, a man who paid attention, who kept what mattered, who built things carefully and loved them thoroughly and did not waste a single good thing that came to him. Belle had spent a long time feeling like a spare person, a convenient presence, a name someone else had put on a train ticket. She was not that. She had never been that. She had only been in the wrong places to know otherwise. Here, in this house, in this desert, under these stars, with this man who had said he was glad here, she was exactly herself and exactly enough and exactly home. On the last day of the year, when 1885 was an hour from becoming 1886, Belle stood on the porch with Isaac beside her and James in his father's arms and William asleep inside, and they watched the stars together in the cold and clear desert dark, and she thought about all the things that had had to go wrong in exactly the right order to bring her to this moment, and she thought that she had no complaints at all about any of it. "Happy?" Isaac said. "Completely," she said. He put his free arm around her shoulders, James tucked against his side looking up at the stars with his wide gray eyes, and the windmill turned slowly in the cold, and the mountain stood patient against the sky, and the desert held all its secret life close in the dark, and above everything, the stars burned in their proper places, every one of them brilliant and certain and entirely where they were meant to be.